October 1781. Rain falls over the trenches outside Yorktown, Virginia. Thousands of British soldiers are trapped between two enemies. In front of them, American and French troops tighten a ring of cannon and earthworks. Behind them, French warships control the Chesapeake Bay. Their commander, Lord Cornwallis, has nowhere left to go. The men surrounding him should never have survived long enough to reach this moment. They are farmers, merchants, immigrants, craftsmen, free black soldiers, and exhausted veterans who have marched without shoes, gone months without pay, and watched entire armies collapse around them. They began the war divided. They had almost no navy, little money, weak central government, and no professional army capable of defeating Britain in a conventional war. Yet now the most powerful empire on earth is cornered by 13 colonies that did not even agree on what they were fighting for. Soon, British drums will beat a slow march. A sword will be offered in surrender, and the world will be forced to accept what once seemed impossible. Britain has lost America. But Yorktown was not the beginning of the revolution. It was the final result of years of anger, fear, ambition, sacrifice, betrayal, and astonishing luck. Because the American Revolution was never simply a story of heroic colonists rising against a cruel king. It was a civil war between neighbors. It was a global conflict fought across North America, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, Europe, and India. It was a war in which enslaved people pursued freedom while slaveholders demanded liberty. It divided native nations, destroyed towns, ruined fortunes, created legends, and exposed the distance between American ideals and American reality. And for much of the war, the Americans were losing. To understand how 13 colonies defeated the British Empire, we must begin not with rebellion, but with a British victory. In 1763, Britain stood at the height of its power. For 7 years, Britain and France had fought across the world. In North America, the conflict became known as the French and Indian War. Britain emerged victorious. France lost Canada. British territory expanded across enormous stretches of the continent. London had defeated its greatest imperial rival and gained new lands that seemed to promise limitless wealth. Many American colonists celebrated as loyal subjects of King George III. Colonial soldiers had fought beside British regulars. One of them was a young Virginia officer named George Washington. He had survived ambushes, defeats, disease, and political humiliation. The experience did not make him a great commander overnight, but it taught him something that would later matter more than tactical brilliance. Armies could survive disasters if their leaders refused to let them disappear. The victory of 1763 should have united Britain and its colonies. Instead, it began the process that tore them apart. The war had been enormously expensive. Britain carried a massive national debt and now had to defend a larger empire. From London's perspective, the solution seemed reasonable. The colonies had benefited from the war. Therefore, the colonies should help pay for it. But the colonists saw the situation differently. For generations, Britain had allowed colonial assemblies to manage many local affairs. Parliament regulated trade, but enforcement was often inconsistent. Colonists elected representatives, raised local taxes, and became accustomed to governing themselves. They did not yet think of themselves as independent, but they had learned to expect autonomy. Then the empire began tightening its grip. In 1763, the British government issued a proclamation restricting settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Officials hoped to reduce frontier warfare and avoid another costly conflict with native nations. To British leaders, the restriction was practical. To land-hungry colonists and speculators, it felt like betrayal. Britain had just conquered an enormous territory from France. Now it was telling its own colonists not to enter it. The question was no longer simply who controlled the frontier. The question was who had the right to decide. In 1764 came the Sugar Act, strengthening customs enforcement and collecting duties on imported goods. Then, in 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The law reached into daily colonial life. Newspapers, legal documents, contracts, licenses, playing cards, pamphlets, and other printed materials required an official stamp purchased from the government. The tax itself was not always financially devastating. Its meaning was far more dangerous. Colonists had long been taxed by their own elected assemblies. Now Parliament, thousands of miles away and containing no elected representatives from America, was taxing them directly. British officials argued that Parliament represented all British subjects through what they called virtual representation. The colonists rejected that argument. Their answer became a slogan: no taxation without representation. At first, resistance came through speeches, petitions, and legal arguments. Then it moved into the streets. In Boston, activists known as the Sons of Liberty organized demonstrations. Effigies were hanged. Tax officials were intimidated. Homes were attacked. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Colonial leaders met at the Stamp Act Congress in New York. Newspapers spread resistance from one colony to another. The colonies had protested before. Now they were beginning to protest together. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, and celebrations erupted across America. But on the same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The tax was gone. The argument remained, and it was becoming more dangerous. In 1767, Parliament imposed new duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea through the Townshend Acts. The revenue would help pay royal officials in America, making them less dependent on colonial assemblies. That detail changed everything. The conflict was no longer only about money. It was about power. If governors and judges could be paid by the crown instead of local assemblies, they could ignore colonial pressure. The political balance that had existed for generations could be broken. Resistance returned. Merchants renewed boycotts. Women produced homespun cloth to reduce dependence on British textiles. Political writers warned that accepting small taxes could establish a precedent for much greater control. In 1768, British troops arrived in Boston. Red-coated soldiers marched through streets filled with civilians who increasingly saw them not as protectors, but as occupiers. The soldiers were poorly paid. Some competed with colonists for work. Insults became fights. Snowballs became stones. Compromise far more difficult. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the East India Company to sell tea more directly in the colonies. The tea could actually be cheaper than before, but it still carried the parliamentary tax. To accept the tea was to accept Parliament's right to tax. In several ports, colonial pressure forced tea ships to leave. Boston was different. Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the ships to depart without unloading their cargo. On the night of December 16, 1773, men boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. Some wore disguises intended to evoke Native Americans. They broke open more than 300 chests of tea and threw the contents into the water. The destruction was disciplined. Other cargo was largely left alone. But the message was unmistakable. Boston had not merely protested British law. Boston had openly defied it. Britain answered with punishment. Parliament passed measures the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts lost much of its local political control. Royal authority expanded. British troops occupied the city. London intended to isolate Massachusetts and frighten the other colonies into obedience. Instead, the punishment united them. Food and supplies flowed toward Boston from distant colonies. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress in 1774. They did not yet declare independence. Many still hoped the king would protect them from Parliament. But they agreed to resist together. Across New England, local militias began gathering weapons and drilling. These citizen soldiers were not a professional army. Most were farmers, craftsmen, or laborers. Yet some were expected to be ready at a minute's notice. They became known as Minutemen. British General Thomas Gage understood that resistance was becoming military. In April 1775, he sent troops from Boston to seize colonial weapons stored at Concord and, if possible, arrest leading Patriot figures. The movement did not remain secret. Riders spread the warning through the countryside. Paul Revere became the most famous, but he was only one part of a larger network. Before dawn on April 19th, British troops reached Lexington. A small group of militia stood on the village green. No one knows with certainty who fired first, but a shot cracked through the morning. Then came a volley. 8 colonists were killed at Lexington. The British continued toward Concord, where they destroyed some military supplies. But at the North Bridge, colonial militia confronted them and forced them back. The British retreat to Boston became a nightmare. Militia fired from behind walls, trees, houses, and fields. The road filled with smoke, confusion, and blood. By the end of the day, hundreds on both sides were dead, wounded, or missing. The war had begun. But even now, independence was not inevitable. Many colonists still believed they were defending their rights as British subjects. The Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia and faced an impossible problem. War existed, but no independent country existed to fight it. The colonies had separate governments, separate interests, separate economies, and deep suspicion of centralized power. They needed an army. They needed a commander. And they needed someone who could make a rebellion in New England look like a continental cause. Congress chose George Washington. He arrived in military uniform, signaling that he was ready to serve. As a Virginian, he gave the Northern Rebellion a broader identity. He was wealthy, experienced, ambitious, physically imposing, and known beyond his colony. He was not always the best battlefield tactician. But the revolution would survive because Washington understood that preserving the army was often more important than winning a single battle. Before he reached Boston, the war produced one of its bloodiest early clashes. On June 17, 1775, colonial forces fortified Breed's Hill overlooking Boston. British troops attacked uphill in discipline lines. The colonists waited until they were close. Then they fired. The first British assault collapsed. The second also failed. Only on the third attack, after colonial ammunition ran low, did the British take the position. The battle became known as Bunker Hill. Britain technically won, but the cost was shocking. More than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The battle proved that colonial forces could stand against regular troops. It also proved that courage alone would not win the war. The Americans lacked gunpowder, training, organization, and stable enlistments. Soldiers often returned home when their terms expired. Disease spread through camps. Congress had little power to collect taxes or compel the colonies to provide supplies. Washington inherited an army that existed largely on paper. Then, in early 1776, American forces placed captured cannon on Dorchester Heights above Boston. The position threatened the British fleet and army. Rather than face bombardment, the British evacuated the city in March. Boston was free. For the Americans, it looked like a great victory. But the British Empire had not yet begun to use its full strength. Britain prepared a massive invasion of New York. Ships, artillery, supplies, and tens of thousands of troops crossed the Atlantic. The force included British regulars and German soldiers hired from several states, many of whom Americans collectively called Hessians. New York offered deep water, strategic access to the Hudson River, and a large loyalist population. If Britain controlled the city and river corridor, it could divide New England from the middle and southern colonies. As the invasion approached, the political argument changed. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense. Paine attacked monarchy in direct, accessible language. He argued that an island should not rule a continent, and that reconciliation with Britain would only invite future abuse. The pamphlet spread rapidly. The king was no longer presented as a distant father who might rescue the colonies. He was presented as the center of the problem. On July 4, 1776, Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Written largely by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration announced that all men were created equal and possessed unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It accused King George III of tyranny and declared the colonies free and independent states. The language was revolutionary. The reality was deeply unequal. Hundreds of thousands of people were enslaved. Women had almost no formal political power. Native nations were not included in the new vision of liberty. Property requirements restricted voting in many places. The Declaration did not create equality, but it created a promise that future generations would use to challenge the nation that signed it. The timing could not have been more dangerous. Only weeks later, the British struck New York. In August 1776, British forces landed on Long Island and outmaneuvered Washington's army. American troops were overwhelmed. Thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Washington's army narrowly escaped destruction by retreating across the East River under cover of darkness and fog. It was not a glorious victory. It was survival. The British captured New York City and drove the Americans north, then across New Jersey. The revolution appeared to be collapsing. Soldiers deserted. Enlistments expired. Civilians rushed to accept British protection. Congress fled Philadelphia. Thomas Paine, now serving with the Army, described the moment in words that became famous. "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington understood that without a victory, his army might dissolve before the new year. So on Christmas night in 1776, he gambled everything. American troops crossed the ice-filled Delaware River during a storm. Many were exhausted, freezing, and poorly equipped. The original plan involved several coordinated crossings, but only Washington's force made it successfully. Before dawn, they marched toward Trenton, New Jersey. There, they surprised a Hessian garrison and captured nearly 1,000 men. The battle was small compared with later campaigns. Its psychological effect was enormous. The revolution was still alive. Days later, Washington won again at Princeton. Then he moved his army into winter quarters in the hills of New Jersey, threatening British positions and encouraging militia resistance. Britain had captured New York, but it had failed to destroy the Continental Army, and that failure would haunt every British strategy that followed. The war was not simply Americans against British soldiers. It divided communities and families. Loyalists believed the Crown offered stability, trade, and protection from chaos. Some feared independence would place power in the hands of local elites. Others had religious, economic, or personal reasons to remain loyal. Patriots often punished them through confiscation, imprisonment, public humiliation, or exile. Violence between neighbors became especially brutal in parts of the South and the frontier. For enslaved people, the war opened a dangerous path toward freedom. In 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to enslaved men belonging to rebels if they joined British forces. Thousands fled plantations and sought British protection. Some served as soldiers, laborers, pilots, guides, or sailors. The British offer was based on military necessity, not a general commitment to abolition. But for many enslaved people, British lines represented the best available chance to escape. Others fought for the American side, especially in northern units, hoping military service would bring freedom or greater rights. The revolution spoke constantly of liberty. Enslaved people forced both sides to confront what that word actually meant. Native nations faced an equally dangerous choice. Many understood that colonial expansion threatened their lands more directly than distant British rule. Several nations, including much of the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy, divided over the conflict. Some supported Britain. Others supported the Americans. Still others tried to remain neutral. The war fractured alliances that had endured for generations. It also carried destruction into native towns and fields, especially during American campaigns in the interior. For native peoples, American independence would not end imperial pressure. It would accelerate westward expansion. In 1777, Britain launched the campaign that was supposed to crush the rebellion. General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada through the Hudson Valley. Another British force was expected to move north from New York City. Together, they would isolate New England. But coordination failed. The British commander in New York, General William Howe, moved instead against Philadelphia, the American capital. Howe defeated Washington at Brandywine and captured the city. Members of Congress fled. The British occupied elegant homes and settled into comfortable quarters. Yet capturing Philadelphia did not end the rebellion. Congress could move. The Continental Army still existed. Meanwhile, Burgoyne's army pushed deeper into hostile territory. His supply line stretched for miles. American militia gathered around him. Trees were cut across roads. Bridges were destroyed. Food became scarce. Near Saratoga, New York, American forces blocked his advance. Fierce battles followed in September and October. Among the most aggressive American commanders was Benedict Arnold, a brave, talented, wounded, and deeply resentful officer whose later betrayal would overshadow his role in the victory. By October, Burgoyne was surrounded. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered more than 5,000 troops. Saratoga changed the war. The American victory convinced France that the rebellion might survive. France had secretly supplied weapons and money to the Americans, partly to weaken Britain and avenge its defeat in the 7 Years' War. Now the French government openly entered the conflict as an American ally. This transformed a colonial rebellion into a global war. Britain now had to defend the Caribbean, Mediterranean interests, Atlantic shipping routes, India, and the British Isles themselves. Spain later entered the war against Britain as France's ally, though not formally as an ally of the United States. The Dutch Republic also became involved. Britain still possessed enormous power, but that power was now divided across the world. While diplomats celebrated the French alliance, Washington's army endured one of its most famous winters. At Valley Forge in 1777 and 1778, soldiers suffered from hunger, cold, disease, poor clothing, and inadequate shelter. The image of barefoot men leaving blood in the snow became part of national memory. The suffering was real, though it came not only from absolute scarcity, but from administrative failure. Food sometimes existed in the surrounding countryside, yet weak transportation, corruption, inflation, and poor coordination prevented it from reaching the army. Thousands became sick. Many died. Yet Valley Forge was not only a story of suffering. It was also a place of transformation. A Prussian officer known as Baron von Steuben trained the army in standardized drills, battlefield movement, camp sanitation, and discipline. He spoke little English and relied on interpreters, demonstrations, and explosive profanity. By spring, the Continental Army was more organized and professional. When the British evacuated Philadelphia in 1778, Washington pursued them across New Jersey. At the Battle of Monmouth, American troops fought the British in extreme heat and held the field. The battle was not a decisive American victory, but it showed that the army that had nearly disintegrated in 1776 could now face British regulars in a major engagement. The war then entered a slower and more complicated phase. In the North, neither side could easily force a decisive conclusion. Britain shifted attention to the South, believing large numbers of loyalists would support a royal restoration. The strategy began with success. British forces captured Savannah in 1778 and Charleston in 1780. The fall of Charleston was one of the greatest American disasters of the war. Thousands of Continental soldiers surrendered. Soon afterward, an American army under General Horatio Gates was crushed at Camden, South Carolina. British power appeared to be spreading across the South, but occupation was harder than conquest. The Southern War became vicious. Patriot and Loyalist militias fought raids, ambushes, and acts of revenge. Farms were burned. Prisoners were killed. Old grudges became political violence. American partisan leaders such as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens attacked British supply lines and disappeared into difficult terrain. Britain could capture cities. It could not easily control the countryside. Then American leadership changed. General Nathanael Greene took command of the Southern Army. Greene understood that he did not need to destroy the British in one battle. He needed to exhaust them. He divided his forces, forced the British to chase him across long distances, and accepted tactical setbacks that weakened the enemy strategically. At Cowpens in January 1781, American General Daniel Morgan arranged his troops in layers. Militia fired and withdrew, drawing the British forward. Continental soldiers then held the line while cavalry struck. The result was a devastating British defeat. At Guilford Courthouse in March, Cornwallis technically won the battlefield but lost so many men that the victory damaged his army. The British could win ground, but every victory made them weaker. Cornwallis eventually moved into Virginia, hoping to disrupt American supply networks and establish a defensible base near the coast. He settled at Yorktown. That decision created the opportunity Washington had been waiting for. But before the final campaign, the Revolution nearly suffered a betrayal at its center. Benedict Arnold had once been one of America's most daring commanders. He fought in Canada, helped win at Saratoga, suffered severe wounds, and repeatedly felt that Congress denied him promotion, credit, and money. His resentment grew. While commanding West Point, a crucial fortress controlling the Hudson River, Arnold secretly negotiated with the British. He planned to surrender the position in exchange for money and status. The plot was discovered when British Major John Andre was captured carrying documents connected to the conspiracy. Arnold escaped to British lines. Andre was hanged as a spy. Arnold later served as a British officer and led raids against his former countrymen. To Americans, his name became another word for traitor. But his betrayal also revealed how fragile the revolution remained. Officers were unpaid. Soldiers mutinied. Congress lacked money. The currency collapsed in value. States often placed local needs above the common war effort. The revolution survived not because it was well organized, but because every time it approached collapse, enough people continued to fight. By 1781, Washington still hoped to attack British-held New York. Then news arrived that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing toward the Chesapeake Bay. French General Rochambeau persuaded Washington to move south against Cornwallis. The decision required secrecy and speed. American and French troops marched hundreds of miles from the New York area toward Virginia. Washington used deception to convince the British that New York remained the target. At sea, everything depended on the French fleet. If the British Royal Navy controlled the Chesapeake, Cornwallis could be reinforced or evacuated. In September 1781, French and British fleets fought near the mouth of the bay. The French prevented the British from entering. For once, the Royal Navy had failed at the exact place and time Britain needed it most. Cornwallis was trapped. American and French forces surrounded Yorktown and began siege operations. Trenches crept closer. Heavy cannon bombarded British positions day and night. To complete the siege line, Allied troops had to capture 2 British redoubts. French soldiers attacked one. American troops under Alexander Hamilton attacked the other with bayonets in darkness. Both positions fell. The Allied artillery moved closer. British defenses collapsed under constant fire. Cornwallis attempted to move troops across the York River, but a storm disrupted the escape. There was nowhere left to go. On October 19, 1781, the British Army surrendered. Cornwallis claimed illness and did not personally appear. His second-in-command led the defeated troops between lines of American and French soldiers. A British officer attempted to offer the surrender sword to Rochambeau. The French commander directed him toward Washington. Washington then directed him to his own second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln. The ceremony was filled with symbolism. But one symbol has often been exaggerated. A British band may have played during the surrender, but the famous claim that it performed a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down" is not securely documented. The world, however, had been turned upside down. A collection of colonies had defeated a global empire. Yet Yorktown did not immediately end the war. British forces still occupied New York, Charleston, and Savannah. Fighting continued in some regions. Peace negotiations took years. In Britain, the surrender destroyed political support for continuing the American war. The government of Lord North fell. British leaders increasingly accepted that reconquering the colonies would cost more than they were willing to pay, especially while conflict continued elsewhere in the world. American diplomats in Europe included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They negotiated carefully, sometimes ignoring French preferences when they believed American interests required it. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The new nation received territory stretching west to the Mississippi River, though native peoples who lived across. Those lands were not represented at the negotiations. The 13 colonies had become a country. But how had they won? The answer was not one battle, one leader, or one moment. The Americans won first because they did not need to conquer Britain. They only needed to survive long enough to convince Britain that reconquest was not worth the cost. Britain could capture cities, defeat armies, and control major ports. But it struggled to occupy a vast territory filled with hostile militia, difficult roads, and populations whose loyalty could change with local conditions. Every British victory created new territory that had to be guarded. Every American defeat mattered only if the Continental Army was destroyed. Washington repeatedly prevented that destruction. He lost major battles. He made serious mistakes. He could be indecisive, overly cautious, or dangerously aggressive. But he understood the political purpose of the army. As long as it existed, the United States existed. The Americans also benefited from geography. The Atlantic Ocean separated Britain from the battlefield. Orders, troops, horses, weapons, and food crossed thousands of miles. Communication took weeks or months. British commanders often acted with outdated information and conflicting instructions. The rebellion also drew strength from local institutions. Colonial assemblies, town meetings, committees, churches, and militia networks provided systems of mobilization that Britain could disrupt but rarely erase. The Patriots did not need every colonist to support independence. They needed enough active supporters to supply armies, enforce loyalty, gather intelligence, and make British occupation dangerous. Foreign assistance was essential. French money, weapons, soldiers, and naval power did not merely help the Americans. They made final victory possible. Without the French fleet at the Chesapeake, Yorktown might never have happened. Without the French alliance after Saratoga, Britain could have concentrated far more power in North America. Spain weakened Britain along the Gulf Coast and threatened other imperial possessions. The wider global war stretched British resources and changed strategic priorities. Britain did not lose because it suddenly became weak. It lost because it was fighting too many enemies across too much of the world. The Americans also won because British strategy repeatedly misunderstood the rebellion. British leaders expected Loyalist support to become stronger once royal troops arrived. Sometimes it did. But military occupation could also create new enemies. Requisitioning supplies, housing troops, confiscating property, and punishing resistance pushed civilians toward the Patriot cause. In the South, Britain found thousands of Loyalists, but also triggered a brutal civil war it could not control. And there was one final reason. The Revolution created an idea powerful enough to survive military disaster. Independence gave the struggle a purpose beyond protesting taxes. The Declaration transformed rebellion into a claim about natural rights and legitimate government. Those ideals were applied selectively and imperfectly, but they gave soldiers and civilians a language that could justify extraordinary sacrifice. Victory did not solve America's contradictions. Equality? Was it a colonial war for independence? Was it a civil war? Was it the beginning of democratic government or the transfer of power from one group of elites to another? The answer is that it was all of these at once. The Revolution expanded political participation for many white men and inspired movements far beyond America. Its language influenced revolutions in France, Haiti, Latin America, and elsewhere. But the same revolution that declared equality left millions outside its promise. That contradiction did not make the Declaration meaningless. It made the Declaration dangerous. Once a nation claimed that rights were universal, every excluded group could ask why those rights did not apply to them. Enslaved people petitioned for freedom. Women questioned political inequality. Abolitionists later turned the founding language against slavery. Civil rights leaders would do the same generations later. The Revolution did not complete the American struggle over liberty. It began it. And the men who won the war were not certain that the new country would survive. Washington understood this better than most. He had watched soldiers freeze, desert, mutiny, and die. He had seen Congress nearly collapse. He had seen personal ambition threaten the cause. He knew that defeating Britain was only the first test. The greater test was whether 13 former colonies could remain united without a king, without an empire, and without a common enemy forcing them together. In December 1783, Washington entered New York City after the last British troops departed. Days later, he met his officers at Frances's Tavern. Many of these men had served beside him for years. They had survived defeats, hunger, disease, and political neglect. Washington attempted to speak, but emotion overcame him. He embraced his officers and said farewell. Then he traveled to Annapolis and resigned his military commission to Congress. He could have used the army to increase his personal power. Instead, he surrendered command and returned home. King George III reportedly remarked that if Washington truly gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. The statement may have grown in the retelling, but the act itself mattered. Revolutions often create military rulers. Washington chose civilian authority. The decision became one of the most important examples established by the Revolution. The war had begun with scattered gunfire on a village green. It ended with a general laying down power. Between those moments, cities burned, families divided, armies starved, enslaved people escaped, native alliances shattered, and empires fought across the globe. The British Empire did not lose because 13 colonies were stronger. It lost because the Americans survived every attempt to destroy them, turned a rebellion into an international war, and made victory more expensive than Britain was willing to endure. The Americans did not win alone. They won with French ships, French soldiers, foreign weapons, local militias, intelligence networks, civilian labor, and the determination of people whose names were never recorded. History remembers Washington crossing the Delaware. It remembers the Declaration of Independence. It remembers Saratoga and Yorktown. But beneath every famous moment were thousands of smaller decisions. A farmer who provided food. A woman who kept a business alive while her husband fought. A messenger who crossed dangerous roads. A soldier who re-enlisted after defeat. An enslaved man who used the chaos to seize his freedom. A civilian who chose one side while knowing his neighbor might choose the other. The revolution was won not in one sudden explosion of heroism, but through 8 years of survival. And when the British finally marched out of Yorktown, they were not surrendering to an army that had never been defeated. They were surrendering to an army that had been defeated again and again and refused to disappear. That was how 13 colonies defeated the British Empire. Not because victory was inevitable, not because they were always united, and not because their cause was free of contradiction. They won because they endured long enough for the impossible to become real. A rebellion became a revolution. A revolution became a nation. And the promise written in 1776 became a question America has been trying to answer ever since. If all people are created equal, who, exactly, is included? The war ended in 1783. The argument never did.